Hello everyone, it's Charlie in Westeros here, and this is my review or commentary for episode 5 of season 3 for Game of Thrones, and the episode is entitled Kissed by Fire. Now, before I get going on this review, I would just like to say I appreciate all the feedback everyone has been giving me for my previous videos. It's truly appreciated, and also thank you to the YouTube user Chosen One for sending me a message just with a few thoughts on this episode. I just want to let you all know that if anyone has any thoughts or opinions on the most recent episodes that you think is important and maybe you would like me to address or mention in my reviews, do feel free to send me a message in my inbox, and I will try to incorporate it into my video and give you credit if you find a hypothesis or a thought that hadn't crossed my mind. So without further ado, let's get into this episode review. So the first scene basically opens with the judgment duel between Beric Dondarrion, the leader of the Brotherhood Without Banners, against Sandor Clegane. Now, I've got to say that Beric's sword was pretty epic. Not only does it, represent the Brotherhood's devotion to this Lord of Light, but we also need to remember that Sandor Clegane fled King's Landing because he's afraid of fire. So naturally, it's a very good tactic to use having a flaming sword against someone who is, of course, afraid of fire. The battle, like I said, is amazing, but eventually Sandor Clegane successfully manages to slice right down into Beric's side in spite of his own fear, and so Clegane wins his judgment duel, but Arya does try to kill him while he is down, because of course she wants to avenge her friend Micah, who was killed earlier in season 1 by the Hound. She is of course stopped, and anyway, Thoros of Myr prays over Beric's body, and suddenly Beric Dondarrion rises and comes back to life. Now, I have quite a few thoughts about Beric rising from the dead, but I will address that in a later scene because it gets addressed a bit later on. So, after that first scene, we then have one with Jon Snow and the Wildlings. They're preparing to basically climb the Great Wall, and in preparation for this, they are interrogating Jon Snow about which castles of the Night's Watch are manned and which ones are unmanned. And we basically learn that there's only 3 that are manned out of, I think, 19. Now, there's still some, namely the warg named Orell amongst the Wildlings who suspect Jon's loyalties. So, to prove his loyalty, Ygritte basically takes Jon's sword and guides him into a cave and forces him to make love to her just to show just how loyal he is to the Wildlings. Now, normally this really doesn't sound like such a bad deal, but as we know, men of the Night's Watch are sworn to celibacy, so Jon, of course, having relations with Ygritte might symbolize him finally breaking his vows with the Night's Watch, and maybe it means he has completely joined the Wildlings, even in his own mind. However, it could also be that, in his logic, he's just following the last orders of the Night's Watch after the man he killed in a fake duel, I guess, ordered him to join the Wildlings to find out what they're all about. So it could be that it's, not an actual betrayal in his mind. And we could kind of get that impression because what I think is further significant to the scene is that Orell, the warg, doesn't trust him still. And as we know from scenes with Bran, wargs sometimes seem to have supernatural abilities, like, being able to see the past, the present in, like, other regions, or even the future. And I wonder maybe if Orell's distrust of Jon isn't just coming from him possessing some kind of sixth sense, and maybe he knows that Jon is still internally loyal to some degree to the Night's Watch, or maybe he's, foreseeing some future event that worries him. These are just hypotheses in my head. Oh, and also a last thought, and again, thanks, Chosen One, for pointing this out. But considering how cold it is outside, and considering Jon and Ygritte went into the cave with the hot springs to relax and bathe. I was kind of wondering, why haven't the other wildlings gone in there to take refuge from the cold and, get cleaned up? I'm just saying. Anyway, there is, after the scene, a very short one with Sandor Clegane, with the Brotherhood Without Banners, and we basically see that Sandor is released, much to Arya's displeasure. So after that short scene, we then have one with Jaime and Brienne, and they've been delivered to Lord Roose Bolton at Harrenhal. And of course, Lord Bolton is one of Robb Stark's bannermen. In this scene, Bolton informs Jaime of the Blackwater from the end of the last season, that great battle, but he does so in a kind of toying way. He almost makes it seem like the Lannisters lost the Blackwater, just to get a reaction of Jaime before they inform him of the fact that they actually did win the battle. Then, Lord Bolton lets Jaime relax a bit. He gives him some comfort in spite of the fact that he's a prisoner. And so Jaime then sees Qyburn to help him clean up the stump where he used to have a hand. In the process of these two characters conversing, we learn that Qyburn used to be a maester, but lost his chain, which symbolizes his membership in the order, because he apparently performed many experiments that were maybe deemed too bold. Now, remember that Qyburn was the only survivor of the Lannisters' retreat from Harrenhal at the end of the last season, so I would warrant his survival is already very suspicious, as are his apparent methods of healing, if you will. Anyway, Qyburn seems to think that Jaime should have his whole arm cut off because it's become infected, but Jaime surprisingly refuses and decides to go through some kind of horrible, painful operation to disinfect his stump, and he even refuses to drink some milk of the poppy, which would be the Westeros equivalent to our morphine, I guess. And the last thing I would like to say about the scene is, did anyone else look at how big and intrigued Qyburn's eyes got as he was operating on Jaime? And maybe it's just me, but it looked like he was really, really into that operation in not so much of the Doctor's way, but more of a creepy, awkwardly into it too much kind of way. Anyway, moving it along, we then get a short scene with Cersei and Littlefinger. In this scene, Cersei expresses her mistrust of the Tyrells, and she wants him to look into what they are plotting and if they are plotting anything. We then have another short scene with Tyrion and Lady Olenna, where they're having a bit of banter because Tyrion needs financial assistance in paying for the heavy costs of the wedding between Margaery and Joffrey, and she basically offers to pay for half the expenses of the wedding, but only after pointing out how important the Tyrells are in supporting the crown at this point. What I loved about this scene was that even though Tyrion didn't overtly ask for assistance, she immediately knew what he came for, and she went right down to business, and it was done in such a funny and clever way, in spite of Tyrion's own surprise at the end of the scene. The next scene we have, there was something that really did stick out to me, though. This next scene was one between Arya and Gendry. Gendry basically reveals he wants to stay with the Brotherhood Without Banners because he wants to work for them, and in spite of Arya doubting his desire to join them, he remains steadfast in his desire to stay with them because he basically reveals that he didn't have much of a family and he feels some kind of connection with this group, I suppose. However, we do get a strange interaction between the two of them, Arya and Gendry, where Arya says she could be Gendry's family in response to his comment, and he basically says, "You wouldn't be my family, you would be my lady." Now, at first I thought this was him expressing some kind of interest in Arya, but then I realized it was basically him saying that she is above him in status, so they can't really be family because of the hierarchical difference between them. However, I do think this line is interesting because maybe it implies some kind of personal bond between them, and even if it's not intended to be sexual, I think there is some kind of double entendre to this line being said. Irrespective of that, we then have another scene where the two Lannister prisoners of Robb Stark are murdered by his bannerman, the Lord Karstark. As a response to this, Robb has the four men who aided Lord Karstark to be hanged, and then he executes Karstark himself by chopping his head off with a sword, kind of like Ned Stark did in the first episode of the first season. Before I get into the repercussions of having alienated the Karstarks, however, I will say that I found the title by which he called, that is to say Lord Karstark called Robb, to be kind of intriguing. That is, he called him the king who lost the North. I think the Lord Karstark is saying this to Robb's face. It reveals a certain wariness that the Northmen have in fighting for him at this point. And it really shows the fact that their home country has been invaded, and they aren't really doing anything about it, which makes it obvious just how Robb's cause isn't necessarily shared by the other Northmen who are fighting under him. This is also demonstrated, of course, when after executing Karstark, half of Robb's forces basically leave him to go back north with Karstark. Or at least we assume they're going back north. We then have Arya, another scene with Arya, go through the names of the people she wants to kill, as well as Thoros of Myr telling Arya that they're going to bring her to Riverrun to her brother Robb. And even though they're not having her as a hostage or ransoming her, he admits they kind of are. In spite of that, Beric does sympathize with Arya about wanting the Hound dead, but he says that they had to be just when it comes to judging him. That whole duel, it was some kind of ritual where, you remember in the first season, where the winner is supposed to be deemed innocent if he wins that duel. So that's just what happened, and they're playing by the rules of Westeros, I guess. Arya does express her confusion at Beric from his ability to come back to life, and then Thoros of Myr reveals that he has brought back Beric Dondarrion from the dead a total of 6 times thanks to his powers from the Lord of Light. However, we also learn that whenever he comes back from the dead, he loses bits and pieces of himself more and more, and it's not just physical, it's also spiritual. And this makes me wonder what he becomes after he rises, if he's losing himself. Also, I just want to point to a contrast to another, I guess, symbol in the series, because in a weird way I'm reminded of the Whites, or as I like to call them, the zombies, that the White Walkers bring back from the dead, only that Beric seems to have been brought back, as opposed to them, from the forces of ice. He's brought back from the forces of fire, if you will. Now, this is treading a little bit onto the books territory, but the book series is called A Song of Ice and Fire, and undoubtedly this title would carry some weight into the TV show as well, I would imagine. So I feel that these powers that bring the dead back on both sides, the side of fire and the side of ice, must play some kind of significance in the series as a whole. But moving away from that, we then get to meet a few new characters in the next scene. The first, who is Stannis' wife. Her name is Lena Solis. She comes across as rather crazed, to say the least, and that rhymed. Anyway, Stannis arrives to see her because he wants to tell her about how he cheated on her with Melisandre. Ironically, though, his wife is okay with it and says he is doing God's work by his actions of cheating, and therefore it can't be seen as cheating or breaking some kind of oath. We then get to see more of her craziness when we notice that there are 3 of her stillborn baby sons in, I think, 3 preservation jars, it looks like. Now, again, not to contrast too much with the book series, but in the books, I felt like she was more of a bitch than a crazy person. However, in the TV series, she just seems completely bonkers. In the scene, we also learn about their only surviving child, who is a daughter named Shireen, and also her mother doesn't seem to think much about her. In spite of his wife's protests, Stannis does go and visit his daughter. Now, when we see Shireen for the first time, she seems like a very sweet and nice girl, and she considers Sir Davos her friend. But we also see that she has a deformity in her face along the side. Now, they don't get into it much in the TV series at this point, but the mark on her face, and I don't think this is much of a spoiler. The mark on her face is left by a disease she suffered as a child called the grayscale, and it basically leaves the dead skin hard and patchy when you recover from it. At least in her case, anyway. They might go into a bit more detail about it later on in the series, but I don't think it's much of a spoiler at this point, to be quite honest. Anyway, Stannis reveals to his daughter that Davos is actually a traitor, much to his daughter's chagrin. Moving it along, we then have a scene with Jaime and Brienne again. They're both washing in a same bath in spite of Brienne's protests at him sharing her tub. Even though Jaime eggs on Brienne a little bit in the scene, he does cave in and apologizes for mocking her when she stands up in the tub, letting freedom ring. So she's basically naked. Something I found very interesting about this scene, and I actually owe it again to the YouTuber Chosen One for pointing this out, and it's a point I agree actually on that he makes. He pointed out that how in the earlier scene with Jaime and Qyburn, that Qyburn had to use boiling wine to burn out the corruption from Jaime's stump before it sets in, and he saw this as a sort of metaphor to Jaime seemingly trying to wash away everything that has been corrupting him so far in the story. And personally, I would even say, to add on to this, that in the bathtub scene we get right now, we get more of the sense further where, Jaime recounts his past to Brienne, where he talks about how he killed the last Targaryen ruler, the Mad King Aerys. I definitely felt that him lying in the bathtub as he tells Brienne how he became the Kingslayer, in order to prevent further loss of life, since the Mad King was ordering the killings of hundreds more people with wildfire during the last moments of his reign. And I think that this image of Jaime shedding his past negative associations or associated images with this, this Kingslayer title are pretty significant. And, when Jaime starts to pass out in the bathtub and Brienne calls out Kingslayer, he totally corrects her right away by saying that his name is Jaime, which is pretty significant because I think he used to respond immediately when people called him Kingslayer. Anyway, after the scene, we see that Shireen has visited Sir Davos in his cell. It's a really touching scene, I felt, where Shireen brings Davos a book about Aegon the Conqueror, who is the first Targaryen to have united the Seven Kingdoms 300 years before the story is set. Shireen then starts to teach Davos how to read. Now, there isn't much to say about the scene except how, touching it was. I have a few thoughts about Shireen I would really like to share, however that is entering actual spoiler territory, so I won't go into that, but before I go on to my next scene, I would ask those who've read the books to listen to the song at the credits in the episode where Shireen is singing, because you'll probably recognize it from the books. Again, don't worry, I'm not spoiling anything there, and it's just something I wanted to note down for those of you who have read the books. Moving it along, we then have a scene with Barristan Selmy and Jorah Mormont talking as they march along with Daenerys' new army, and Barristan basically reveals how he is happy to finally be able to serve under a monarch who he truly believes in. We also get to see Dany's new Unsullied general, who was selected by the Unsullied themselves. His name is Grey Worm, and in spite of the fact that he was given this negative name by his previous owner, and that it was meant to be an insult, and that she even permits the Unsullied to pick new names to bring them honor, Grey Worm surprisingly chooses to keep this name because it was the name he had when Daenerys had arrived to free the Unsullied. The camera then pans back to Barristan and Jorah, who are starting to argue over who should be Dany's right-hand man, basically, both of whom basically argue that they themselves are better suited for that position than the other person, and to say the least, I think it's very safe to assume that this just spells some room for further arguments and intense conflict within Dany's own ranks in the near future. Who knows, maybe there's a love triangle developing. Just kidding. I wish I could say more about this scene, but one thing I think it does effectively convey is just how much of a leader Daenerys is really becoming and how strong she is at this point. Which, if you go back to the first season, you'll really see her personality is totally black and white from that period. Anyway, we then have Robb and his wife Talisa talking in the next scene. We discover that half his troops have indeed deserted him, as they were basically Karstark's men. So he needs to improve his army. And the only place he can even get that army is from Walder Frey, who is, of course, the same man whose daughter or granddaughter or great-granddaughter or something like that he was supposed to marry. and as part of an alliance in Season 2. This, of course, leads us to understand that he's going to have to find some way to make it up to the Freys in order to salvage this ruined alliance he basically created after he married Lady Talisa. Next, we have a quick succession of scenes. The first is Margaery and Sansa watching Loras Tyrell sword fighting with some men. Sansa is just gushing about being excited to marry Loras, and the only thing that we, the audience, can think is that she needs to really get her gaydar fixed. As Loras Tyrell practices a squire, I think, and I think his name was Oliver or something, approaches him and basically propositions him for some hanky-panky, which turns out to be the next scene. In the midst of their fornication, the next scene, Loras pretty much reveals to this guy that he is supposed to be marrying Sansa eventually. The man then turns out to be in the service of Peter Baelish in the next scene, as he tells him of it, and then again after that, Peter is discussing with Sansa that he plans to leave King's Landing very soon. Sansa basically communicates her intent that she isn't really sure if she's ready to leave, and that she doesn't want to endanger Peter. So we're basically left with the notion that Peter will go to the Eyrie without Sansa. And, of course, we all are left thinking that the only reason why she doesn't want to leave King's Landing is because of Loras Tyrell, which, in my mind, is kind of silly, but anyway. So now we have the last scene of the episode, which is one with Tywin, Cersei, and Tyrion. From this scene, we learn that not only is Tywin aware of the Karstark's men have been deserting Robb Stark, but he is more significantly aware that the Tyrells are intending to marry Sansa to Loras. Now, this poses the question as to who informed Tywin in the first place. It could, of course, very well be Peter Baelish, since we see him the entire episode, or at least for a part of the episode, trying to discover their intentions with Sansa, of course under the orders of Cersei, and maybe he let the cat out of the bag after Sansa revealed her apprehension of going with him to the Eyrie. But it is possible he discovered this from another source, maybe? At the end of the day, Tywin wants to outmaneuver the Tyrells, of course, and he plans to do this by marrying Tyrion to Sansa and his daughter Cersei to Loras, in order to both further cement the Lannister-Tyrell alliance, and also because, of course, Sansa, in the case of Robb's death, and because, of course, we assume that her two brothers are, or at least the characters in the show assume that her brothers are dead, she basically becomes the heir to the north, which is a huge chunk of land, and basically means that if Tyrion were to marry her, a Lannister would inherit all that realm. Naturally, both Tyrion and Cersei are disturbed by their father's intent for each of them, which comes naturally as no surprise, since it would mean Tyrion is going to marry a child for all intents and purposes, and we already know he is basically devoted to Shae, while Cersei's emotions are more or less directed at her brother Jaime, even though he's been missing, and even though she kind of cheated on him in the first season with, I think it was her cousin, actually. But for me, what kind of disturbs me personally the most, though, is that Tywin is planning to marry a pair of siblings, i.e. Margaery and Loras, to a mother and a son, so Joffrey and Cersei. And that kind of weirds me out personally, but maybe that's not too weird for the world that we're looking at. Anyway, now for my concluding thoughts. The episode overall was decent, I would say. However, I wish we got to see more of Daenerys, but that's mainly because I am biased. Overall, we got a fair share of nudity, and I think the Jon Snow and Ygritte sex scene was one that everyone was expecting for some time. What I'm hoping to see for the next episode is how Robb intends to broker an alliance with the Freys, especially after he basically insulted them by rejecting their originally planned alliance in favor of him marrying Lady Talisa. Also, this episode seems to be really building up some epic events that are bound to occur during the last few episodes, and I can't wait for them, to be very honest. So, just a few notes before I end this video. My upcoming reviews for the next month may come a bit late and might be slightly rushed because I am going to be in Europe starting this Friday until June 1st, I believe. So I will be in France, Belgium, and Germany for a study tour. So that basically means I will be doing the next 3 episodes, reviews in Europe, and my before last one will be in Quebec when I get home, and my final one will be done here in Toronto. So expect to see me moving around a lot for the next reviews. Also, if you enjoyed this review, please do feel free to like this video or subscribe to my channel. And if you think there is anything I can do to improve these videos, please do let me know. Again, thank you, Chosen One, for sharing your thoughts in the inbox. I really appreciate that. And if anybody else has any thoughts they would like me to address when the next episode comes up, do let me know. So without further ado, that is all for now. So I will say bye for now. Take care.